Yeah, thanks everyone for having me here. It's really an honor to be here. I'd also like to recognize, the lands that we're on, which is Potawatomi, my tribe, also the Odawa and Ojibwe, and we're all related together. It's a real honor to speak in this seminar about a passionate topic of mine, and that's sort of thinking about building relationships with tribes to solve our 21st century problems. But we've got all these wicked environmental, social, economic issues coming to a head, and I think that we aren't able to solve them unless we can work together. So building partnerships with tribes, looking at how tribes have managed resources is really a way forward. And I hope by the end of this that you'll agree with me that really this is how we need to solve our 21st century natural resource management issues. So as was said, I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. I work for the U.S. Forest Service. I've also got adjunct appointments in the Forestry Department and American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. I hear the fan, so I'm not sure. Let me know if you need me to kick up the volume. So I've worked a lot on tribal issues from after I got my master's at Penn State. I worked for the Oneida Tribe in Wisconsin. I'm from Green Bay. Worked in environmental planning. I was telling some of the students earlier, I didn't know what planning was before I got that internship. I was doing ecology, forest disturbance, and sort of ecophysiology. And I needed a job before I joined the Peace Corps. I was going to Bolivia, but I had about 9 months to fill the gap. And from Green Bay, I've worked with the Oneida Tribe, just go to their powwows, I know the community, and they said, hey, we've got these internships, check it out, it's in planning. And I thought, all right, let's do this, I need a job, I like the Oneida, it'll be fun. And what I didn't realize was that I had been missing the people component of forestry my whole education. So this is in the mid-90s. Where are the people? And for me, I saw that in planning, where the goal of planning is to bring different people together to talk about problems and to develop goals and objectives for management. And that changed my career. Right? I've done planning essentially ever since, trying to get people to come together to share ideas and manage our natural resources for common goals. I'm going to talk a little bit about community forestry in the United States, indigenous forestry. Then I'm going to move into some tribal innovations. We talk a lot about, or I talk a lot about, tribes having innovative solutions, and we can learn from that. So I'll just show a few examples. There's lots of them out there. And then I'll end up with some of the research that I've done on actually how do people form partnerships with tribes. And these are real practical, 5 kind of practical things that have come out of my research to do that. So then we'll have 15 or maybe even a little bit more minutes for questions and discussion. So community forestry. I didn't realize it when I started my PhD program, but this is exactly what I was interested in. This is a classic definition of community forestry, basically saying that the goal of community forestry is to conserve forest ecosystems while improving the well-being of communities. The health of the ecosystem and community is linked. That's a good definition. I like that. It's also a definition that many of our tribal communities can understand. That you hear a lot of tribes, as I'll get into, I've worked with the Menominee Tribe quite a bit. The health of the Menominee forest is related to the health of the people and vice versa. Now, that's not a foreign concept to most of the tribes that I work with. The healthy forest means healthy people, and vice versa. And so really, tribal forestry is community forestry. And if you go in and look at the Tribal Forest Management Act, just like there's a National Forest Management Act for the national forests, there's a Tribal Forest Management Act. It essentially dictates community forestry will be the goal. It says that forest management has to sustain the ecosystem as well as the community, people. Provide sustainable opportunities. So not only is it valued by the tribes, but it's dictated in law. And so American Indian forestry, we've got over 570 federally recognized tribes. Marie, do you know the 572? They added a few in Virginia several months ago, and I haven't updated my figures.
We'll go with 576.
572 sounds good to me too. 302 have significant forest lands, totaling about 18 million acres. That's a pretty big number. It's a substantial land base, and I'll show a map to kind of explain that. But also when you consider, like here, we're on tribal land that's historic and ancestral lands. All of our forest land was like that, right? Forest Service, all of our Forest Service land was tribal land at one point. So you can look at 18 million acres as a kind of it's a big chunk, but it's not like the Forest Service. You start adding in the Forest Service, the Park Service, the BLM, all these lands that were tribal lands. And really American Indian forestry, that well-being of the forests and people is extremely important for that management. I also like to basically start off by stating the obvious, that tribes have managed these forests for generations for different values. Right? Whether it be spiritual values, cultural values, economic values. They've been doing that. And that they've managed these forests through many, many changes. Again, I'll show you the Potawatomi, just a quick example of my tribe. But we've had environmental changes. We've had social changes. We've had economic changes. And we've managed these forests through all of that. And those are important lessons for us to learn. And then finally, each one of these 570 federally recognized tribes are different. They all have separate tribal governments. They have different goals and objectives for management. And even within each one of those tribes, there are different communities. Just like we have different communities. Not everyone agrees with what the tribal government says, right? Not everyone agrees with what the federal government says. It mirrors us, right? You have some people that are interested in certain things, maybe more environmental preservation, some people that want more use. There's different goals and values within the communities, different families, different clans, different histories that those families pass on. And it's really important to recognize that, especially when forming partnerships, because you have to be aware of who you're forming partnerships with and what that really means. So as a federal agency, federal employee, I'm required to form partnerships or relationships, consult with the governments of the tribes. That's what's required. But understanding that there's more than just the government out there is an important component of working with tribes as well. So here's the map. You can go to, I went to nationalatlas.gov to get the Michigan map, and it came up blank. There's a new website for this, but you'll be able to find it if you type it in. This shows all the federal lands. The tribal lands are this red color. The rest of them are Park Service, Forest Service, BLM. And you can see here, well, let me just click through a little bit. Here's Minnesota, where I am. Big national forests, large tribal land bits. This golden color, these are like wildlife refuges, Fish and Wildlife Service. Here's Wisconsin. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Menominee, which is right here. Green Bay, so I worked on the Oneida Reservation. And then I went to find Michigan, like I was saying, and you see just a few larger tribal land holdings, pretty big national forests, a lot of land in that. One of my points in showing these maps is that the importance of partnership. Again, all these lands were tribal lands, but the proximity of them is important. The fact that tribes have treaty rights that need to be responded to on these public lands is important. So you can't respond to that and manage those treaty rights, manage the lands, if you don't have partnerships. So this is really the reason why I do a lot of the research I do. How do we form these partnerships? So here's the Michigan. This was a little bit better for me to get more context for Michigan to show. This is from Central Michigan University. There's a picture of the tribal communities throughout the state, not just the larger reservation holdings. This makes forestry difficult, right, for tribal forestry. Talk about the checkerboard. Not all land is in tribal ownership, yet the tribes have legal rights and also values associated with that management. So, to reiterate that tribes have used forests for all sorts of things: cultural activities, economics, hunting and fishing, spiritual or religious ceremonies, access to sacred sites, all these things. We have a group of Native youth up in Alaska. This was Tanana Chiefs up in Alaska. They were welcoming us for the Intertribal Timber Council meeting a few years ago. Here's a picture of Menominee cutting a nice tree. That's a more contemporary picture. Got some Ojibwe birch bark, gentleman making basket for winnowing Menominee, wild rice, canoe. These forests are important. Even the baskets, right? There's a deep cultural tie to baskets, but many Indian families, if you talk to them, have used those baskets as an economic resource when needed. Right? You could sell baskets and get money. Right? If you needed food for your family, those baskets could translate into that. Aside from being that deep cultural connection to Menominee and the use in those ceremonies for processing their rice. Now I'm going to go into a story about the origins of sustainable forest management in the United States. And this is a story that I did my dissertation work on. So this is based on that research, based on I worked with Menominee. I lived there for maybe 8-9 years. Really got to know the foresters, really got to know the community. I'm from Green Bay, so that's, Green Bay's right here. I know that community. I understand it. And I always heard about Menominee Forestry. Have people heard about Menominee? Yeah, quite a few of you. Okay, great. So this is a map that the tribe made, Menominee Tribe made, about showing their ancestral territories, more or less, in Wisconsin. One of the things, I started playing lacrosse and traditional wooden stick lacrosse, and I like to see there's a lacrosse stick on this one, which is cool. Menominee are from here. Unlike our tribes, there's no real origin story. They're from this area. They've always been there. Right? And this is their land base. And you can imagine the depth of knowledge that comes from being in a place for such a long time. Literally as long as their people existed. They've been in this area and they're still here. Here's a county level map of Wisconsin. I should say this background is taken, and I have a picture that's not kind of grayed out, but that's taken from one of the fire towers out of the Menominee Reservation. It's about 95% forested and managed for sustained yield forestry. They have 2 goals for management that have translated into amazing ecological properties in this forest. 1, manage for diversity of species. So they're looking at the ecological habitat types and managing to make sure that all of those habitat types are represented on the forest that should be there. So they have detailed maps and inventories that help them make those decisions. And then the second thing that they manage for is high quality saw timber. So they're doing things like growing trees a little bit longer than we would on the national forest, for example, or in private lands, getting them a little bit bigger. Maybe if you just calculated the economics, that wouldn't really play out. They're not doing it for free. This is high quality timber, but they're growing it a little bit bigger. Those are the 2 goals that over time have really helped them manage their forests in such a way that is truly sustainable. And from 1854, when they signed their second to last treaty, ceding all that territory that we've seen to the U.S. government, until today, they've been harvesting and milling timber. In the 1850s, it was smaller scale, more or less little mills, kind of portable type mills on the river, right? Until, and I'll get into 1910, they built a modern sawmill. And here's kind of an aerial photo. That looks a little dated too, but essentially it looks like that. The mill is still there. So from 1854 until today, they've been harvesting and milling for timber. This is not to mention the management that happened for the hundreds and hundreds of years before this. This is just forestry as us foresters think about it, right? Timber, milling. The question in my mind as a researcher is, how do you define sustainability? Again, this is from one of the fire towers. In the Menominee, many of them will say, check this out. Check out Google Earth. this is how we define sustainability. And as you can see the outline of this reservation. That's how we define sustainability. Look at it. We've been doing this for almost 200 years now. And it's higher quality today than it was when we started. They're going for high quality saw timber. So if you look at the grading over time, it's getting better. And there's more volume than when they started. And that's a story I'm not going to tell today, but as ecological change happens over the landscape and fire is removed from the system, you see more trees grow up, right? So there's more volume, higher quality on this reservation. And they've harvested an equivalent of clear cutting, you know, if you just liquidated it in one fell swoop, they've done the 2.5 to 3 times the volume. And they've got more and higher quality than when they started. Again, that's what they say is sustainability. Where's this coming from? This was a treaty medal. A lot of medals were given from the federal government to tribes at the treaty times. So this was, they think this was 1853, right before that 1854 treaty. So it was part of the treaty negotiations. Gifts were often offered. 1854, the Menominee. There was an earlier treaty that tried to remove them. Again, my reservation is in Oklahoma. We were removed from here to Oklahoma, Kansas, and then Oklahoma. Menominee, they wanted to remove them to the federal government. And they've always been very astute. They've been kind of a smaller tribe in this area with a lot of Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Odawa tribes, right? We're all in this same general region together. They've always been very astute. Remember, when were the French there? In the 1600s. They've been dealing with intercultural sort of partnerships, communication for many, many years. They're very astute. And they said, okay, this is 1848. We'll go to check out Minnesota where you want to move us to, but if we kind of reserve the right, if it's not going to suit our needs, we want to come back here to our land. They've always been in Wisconsin. Right? Of course, Minnesota wasn't appropriate for them, and they were able to renegotiate a new treaty in 1854 that said that they could permanently stay there and set up that reservation like we see, right? And like I said, from that time, they started small-scale milling of timber. One of the treaty-era leaders of Menominee is Chief Oshkosh. So he was one of their leaders that was setting up the treaties and how they were going to move into this new era, these ecological, social changes that were happening. And he basically said for the Menominee that they could do sustainable forestry, that they could start at, you can read this quote, they could start at one end of the reservation and go to the other and do that forever. This is a definition of sustainable forestry. This is what the Menominee were looking for when they signed those final treaties. A way to become foresters, essentially. They're not eschewing the market economy, they're not eschewing technology, they're using the technology and economy for their own goals. And what's their goal in this, you can see in the quote, to maintain trees forever. Essentially saying, this forest is part of our community and we are going to do something. And we know, because we've lived here for so long, that you can actually do this. This is different. Again, this is 1850s. This is a very early definition of sustainability that every Menominee person you talk to will talk about Chief Oshkosh. So then we move forward to 1890. And you don't have to read this all. I like it because it looks kind of old. But 1890, this is the first law that's limiting harvest. And it says right at the bottom, it says basically on the Menominee Reservation, they have to limit harvesting to 20 million board feet per year. 20 million board feet per year. 1890, there's no Forest Service yet. This is right before the Biltmore School. This is federal law. And for the United States government, this was really good. This was great because the government at that time was basically taking tribes and making them farmers. And they thought Menominee, at one point Menominee was in the middle of nowhere, right? There wasn't a lot of access to it. So they were thinking, okay, Menominee has a very kind of closed, isolated community. If they harvest 20 million board feet per year, slowly, over time, they will clear cut and start farming as the reservation turned from forest to non-forest. So for the US, this was great. For the Menominee, this was also great, but for another reason, and that's that Chief Oshkosh vision of being able to harvest trees forever. If you're limiting it to 20 million board feet, you're never taking all of it at once. And this is 1890s, the height of the volume. If you look at the volume tables, I think it's 1889 is the height of the volume coming out of the lake states. They're seeing what's going on. And Menominee are saying, we can do this forever. This can actually help us. Again, Menominee have been very astute politically over the years to be able to get something like this passed. Right? It doesn't stop at 1890, although now, when I say sustainable forestry started in Wisconsin on the Menominee Reservation, that's what I'm talking about. Here are some of the early leaders. Again, early sawmill pictures, a log drive. Now I move forward. This is Senator Bob LaFollette. He was governor of Wisconsin. He was a senator, one of the progressive eras, friends with Gifford Pinchot. He was, as you might know, the progressive era politicians were about breaking monopolies and making sure that the citizens of the United States owned their resources. Right? That was one of the tenets. Scientific forestry was another tenet. Right? But certainly, the federal lands shouldn't be going to railroad monopolies to profit. The profit should accrue to the citizens. And he also believed and wrote extensively about Indian land and resources, that those profits should go and accrue to the tribe. So Menominee, you have Menominee that want to do forestry, you have early laws, they want to continue to do forestry, and from this progressive point of view, we can use scientific forestry in conjunction with the tribe benefiting from this forest management. We can help them do that. And that really is the progressive vision in a nutshell on Menominee. So in 1906, he gets a law passed that's essentially reiterates 20 million board feet a year, gives them resources to set up a sawmill, a permanent sawmill, to start harvest, and helps them with the management of that sawmill. Now there were a few iterations that had to happen with this sawmill. This is around 1910. That's a picture of that sawmill right after it was built. There were a few iterations because it wasn't always that Menominee people got jobs there. Right? So they had to come back and pass a few more laws saying, wait, Menominee people need to work there. You can't just keep them out and manage it yourself. One of the things that they did in those early years was, again, experiment with silviculture. At this point in time, so we're now like 1910, early 1900s, the pine at this point has been pretty much harvested, and they're starting to get into hardwoods now. Right? You can't float the hardwoods, so you need more railroads, that railroad technology, bringing logs to the mill. I think there was a question of how to do silviculture in order to perpetuate that forest. And the Forest Service was definitely all about this science of management, how do we perpetuate sustained yield timber. And Menominee is a place where they were able to start doing some of that. And again, they still do it today. So this is my conclusion of the Menominee story. I want everyone to remember sustainable forestry started on the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin. Right, from that treaty all the way until today. They're still doing it. All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about innovations. So we just saw an innovation in sustainable forest management. Right? So tribes have been doing this for a long, long time, innovating in forest management, natural resource management. I co-edited a volume of Journal of Forestry with my colleague Sarah Hoagland. And so if you go to this issue, it's 2017, 115, volume 5. That's a whole double issue. It's a double issue of articles about innovations in tribal forestry. It's really good. There's a lot of great stuff in there, including articles about Menominee, articles about silviculture, articles about cultural resource management, etc. So some of these come from there. Just show a few things. So a lot of times in the Forest Service we hear, oh, the tribes are doing this great stuff. So this is on the White Mountain Apache Reservation, fire fuels management. Our Forest Service people would often like to be able to manage like the tribes are managing. And the tribes are held up, especially in this fire realm, as they're doing everything we would love to be doing. They're innovating. And the question is, how are they doing that? Here's a pine barrens restoration on the Menominee Reservation. A little bit more, little less dense. This is sand. A true barrens. They got big blue stem to come up after these burns. It was pretty cool. So tribes are innovating. They're actually out there doing it. They're able to do it. Another thing that I think tribes are innovating is around climate change and invasive species. So I couldn't find a good picture, so I apologize for this. But the Fond du Lac Reservation in Minnesota is working on common garden experiments to try to find trees that will deal with climate change and replace ash, black ash, and there's ash swamps. They're really worried about hydrological changes after emerald ash borer comes through, and it's literally right next door. They're really close to the city of Duluth and Cloquet, and they have emerald ash borer there. It hasn't gotten to the reservation that anyone knows of yet, but it's coming. It's right on the doorstep. So they're actually doing scientific experiments, common garden experiments, planting out different species, including things like silver maple, to see what's gonna take over, or what could take over that ecological niche that they're going to be losing. One of the reasons tribes are innovating like this is because their reservations aren't going to move. We're going to have climate change and invasive species that impact tribal lands, but those reservations are set from the treaties essentially, right? They're lines on a map that aren't going to be moving, even if the resource moves. So they're extremely interested in solutions today. I'm a planner, I like to do planning, I like to have meetings and write plans. That's important, but actually doing innovative projects on the ground, like this. They're doing this themselves. This isn't like a Forest Service research project. This is the tribe saying, what tree species are we going to plant in 4 years when this EAU comes through? And I think all this tribal innovation flows from sovereignty. On some level, the tribes are able to do things on their land because they're sovereign, there's sovereign control over that land. Another, again, is because they're responsible for that. And finally, I got to show my Michigan State picture here. I think tribes are innovating in terms of partnership building and collaboration. Right? So here's a picture with some Michigan State people with the College of Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, working on collaboration around climate adaptation planning. Again, tribes can't move their reservations. Tribes aren't just going to leave and go to a different state. We're staying in our lands, and we need to really figure out how to deal with these changes that are coming. Tribes are innovating in partnerships with the federal government. So here's the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. That's the intertribal treaty group that's managing off-reservation treaty rights in the Great Lakes, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. We just signed our 20-year MOU, or ceremony for 20 years of Memorandum of Understanding, a formal agreement of how to work together. Those 20 years weren't let me say, those 20 years were difficult. It was hard to figure out how to work together, looking at the history, looking at the changes. But again, these are things that need to happen in order to manage our resources to the future. So tribes are innovating and building partnerships. And now I'll kind of switch into my final thing. I wanted to be done by 4:15, so I'm right on target. This is information about partnership building. I always start with trying to get people to understand the different levels of partnerships that you might have. So as a federal employee, I'm required, the Forest Service is required to have partnerships and consultation is the word, with federally recognized tribes, the individual tribes. Those 572 tribes need individual treatment by the federal agencies. We're required to do that. We have a legal responsibility that goes from the Constitution, case law, regulation, policy, etc. We have to do that. Another area, so again, it's 570 is a lot. It's hard to do. They're all different. They have different goals, histories. Right? One tribe might love the Forest Service because something happened. Another tribe might not because something else happened. Those things might change through time, right? So it's a lot of work to build all those partnerships. So oftentimes federal managers, or anyone for that matter, likes to work with aggregates. So we can say, well, I really like to work with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, or the Chippewa Ottawa Resource Authority, CORA here in Michigan. That's a little easier, because then you're grouping tribes together. But that doesn't take the place of the official consultation. The tribes themselves in those treaty groups have gotten together and agreed that these are the representatives to these groups, and this is how they're going to work to manage off-reservation rights. So it's not to say that those groups don't have power and don't need to work with the Forest Service. We still need to work with them. But it doesn't replace the tribal consultation that needs to happen. There's also sort of national level groups. Like I work a lot with the Intertribal Timber Council. I've got partnerships with them. We're doing a research project right now looking at tribal natural resource research needs. It's basically querying all of those tribal natural resource people and see what kind of research and information they have and what their access and barriers to access to research is. That's with an agreement with the Intertribal Timber Council. There's tribal institutions, I've already mentioned, College of Menominee Nation. There's 36 tribal colleges in the United States. These are all institutions, typically chartered by the tribe. So you're not working, you can have an agreement there, that's really good, and we need that to build partnership. But that's not the tribal government. Right? That's a tribal institution. And then finally, I think there's projects and partnerships for something like this, Wings and Seeds Project, which is around, it's a pollinator project. So some botanists from the Forest Service, botanists from the multiple tribes, tribal natural resource managers all got together and they're working on this pollinating project. They bring youth together, I think, in the summers. They work on habitat protection. That's like any of our other partnerships around that topic. So it's important to understand the level of partnerships that we have. I'm going to give you three, these are just my thoughts about working with tribes. So this isn't really based, these next three slides aren't based on research, it's kind of me. But I have a long history of working with tribes, different tribes, and building partnerships. So the one I've already mentioned, but tribes are diverse. They're diverse amongst themselves and they're internally diverse. There's no monolithic tribal voice. And certainly when you start at those aggregates of multiple tribes, that institution might have a voice, but that doesn't represent every tribe, right? The tribes are diverse. Two, tribes are resilient and forward-thinking. I've already mentioned we've managed through social, ecological, environmental, and economic change. People have probably seen this map. Yeah, this is showing 2095 summers from some of the climate models of the Great Lakes region, what it's going to look like by 2095. Here we're in Michigan, we're down in Oklahoma territory, Minnesota as well, Wisconsin. That's the projection. That's pretty stark. So again, my tribe's in Oklahoma, and let me tell you, it's hot in the summer. None of us are going to like that. That's major climate change. But we did that, right? We did that in 1838. So here's a map. Michigan doesn't show up, so it starts in Indiana. But this is where our families went through. Into Kansas and then down to Oklahoma. We dealt with that. We're still there. We've learned how to adapt and be resilient in that new environment. And one, we have something to share about it because we've done it. But two, we need to be working with tribes for all those treaty rights, etc. And the fact that these are our ancestral territories. In the final, just my own thought, I should say that last one, Robin Kimmerer talks about quite a bit. Kyle White probably talks about it as well. I first saw it with Robin. We're all members of the same tribe. The third thing is we are all related. And this kind of goes back to that community understanding that people in the forest are related. Right? Plants and animals are relatives. These are two students. Oh yeah, this is the Mexican spotted owl I was talking about before. They were students of my friend Sarah Hoagland. Somewhere, maybe New Mexico, I think that's where she did a lot of her work. We're all related. And that's easy on the surface, I think. It's taken me even time to really try to think about this, and I think we all struggle. It's easy to say, oh yeah, we're relatives. I get that. Okay, that's my relative. That's a relative. Menominee is important. But I ask all of you to really step back and think about what it means to be a relative. And so these are the kids. Birch bark. It's profound. And you can't get that on the surface. So take time to think about it and really try to understand it. All right, the last 5 slides here. This comes from work where we interviewed Forest Service tribal liaisons. So we have a national organization that works with tribes, goes to the regional level, down to the national forest level. So we interviewed people across the country, interviewed maybe 20 some of 30 people that work in this field for the Forest Service, and basically asked them, how do you build partnerships and what's important? So 5 of these. 1, these formal relationships, I've already mentioned memorandums of understanding, are extremely important. It's important to have, for the Forest Service, government-to-government consultation. We have MOUs, right? One of the quotes from the interviews that we did in this project says, formal consultation is an ongoing dialogue that's continuous, that builds a relationship. So it's not just the MOU out there, it's not just the signed document, it's an ongoing thing, right? That's important to build partnerships. It keeps everyone on the same page for the most part. If there's changes in personnel, there's something to hold up. Well, we agreed to this. With our Forest Service in Glyphwood 20 years with an MOU, it says we will have an annual meeting in, I think it even says in October. Here it is on the paper. We all know that. So that's important. But that's the bare minimum of building partnerships. It's important, but it's not the only thing. The 2, and you've already seen this picture, is developing personal relationships. This is key. All of the people that we interviewed work on this for the Forest Service said this is really important. How do you do that? You work on going to tribal colleges and giving a talk on your specialty. You go to a powwow. You eat food with community members. You show up at a community event that has nothing to do with forestry per se. Earth Day's a great one. A lot of the tribes do Earth Day stuff. Check it out, right? This is building that personal relationship. A quote to illustrate that, one of our interview participants said, I consider most of these folks, that's the tribal folks, I worked with for many years as family. So they're not just people I work with, they're friends. That's that deep personal relationship. Here, these are all the Forest Service people at the Intertribal Timber Council meeting this last year. Strategy number 3 is that we need to respect, listen, and build trust. Kind of brought some things together there with that. But essentially, the people told us, I think it's all of our responsibility to listen once in a while and not just talk at people. I love to talk. I've been talking all morning. I should say all afternoon. I need to step back and listen. What are people telling me? What are the goals and objectives? And that's a form of respect, right? That's where that respect comes in. And what it does is it builds trust. And as one interview participant told us, collaboration is built on trust. Fourth partnership building strategy is it's extremely important to have engaged leaders who are demonstrating the value of these partnerships. So here's a picture of one of the previous chiefs of the Forest Service at the College of Menominee Nation setting up a partnership. The leader of the organization comes and says, this is an important thing to do. Every employee sees that. I saw that in this last administration where the Deputy Undersecretary for Agriculture is a White Mountain Apache tribal member. Every time he visited a site, the Forest Service needed to brief him on what they were doing with tribes. That told everyone that it was important to build partnerships and work with tribes on natural resource issues. It was amazing to see that shift when we had someone that would, I kid you not, every time he would show up at a meeting or at an office, there was hours and hours of back work to get those leaders who might not know a lot about tribal relations up to speed on what's happening with tribes in their particular office or region. And it's amazing, and that breeds that leadership, that demonstrating that it's important, builds partnerships. And then finally, and I think we all can agree on this one, it's important to work together on projects. I already blew my planning joke, but lots of times we have meetings, we sit around in conference rooms and talk about stuff. But you can't replace walking on the land together and talking about stuff and actually doing projects. Again, tribes are wanting to implement projects to deal with invasive species and climate change and natural resource problems. Right? They want restoration. Well, let's go out and do some of that together. So here's a picture of learning how to collect ash seeds, process those seeds for storage, and then store them. We set up a workshop. We're not just doing the workshop for the workshop's sake. We're actually out there collecting seeds, working on the ground. I think I have a quote to illustrate this one. Yeah. So one of our interviewees said, I want Forest Service units to see tribes as part of our solution to our land management challenges, part of our Forest Service family. This is getting out there and doing work. And you can think about building partnerships as you learn a lot about somebody by walking in the woods or going out in a canoe. And this is really integral. So those are my 5 points, and I think I nailed the time. 1 minute over. In conclusion, I all want, repeat after me, that sustainable forestry started with Menominee. Each tribe is different. And it's okay that they're different. We just need to recognize that. Building relationships is key. Both formal and informal is important. And I really believe through those innovations and through the knowledge that tribes have, that they're playing an important innovative role in our 21st century management. Without tribal partnerships, we're not going to be able to move forward and deal with all of our problems. This, however, takes time, it takes leadership, and it takes understanding. So we all need to work on this. A couple recommendations or suggestions. You know, there's lots of people on this campus that work with tribes. There's probably individuals here in the department that do it as well. I suggest reaching out across the college, I guess. American Indian Studies. The law program here is second to none. there's a lot of expertise that I think can really provide value both for the forest management, natural resource management side, but also to their side as well. Because our issues really do deal with land and ecology. And I work with the American Indian Studies in Minnesota, and I really see the value when I come and talk about forestry, ecology, land use change, and that combined with a lot of the historical and cultural information that those students and faculty are pulling together makes a more powerful story. So there's a lot of people here on campus to do that with. And then finding those common projects to get out on the land together. Because one, you're doing something, you're collecting ash seeds, or you're measuring, a common garden experiment to see which trees are surviving or not, or could survive better in changing climate. But you're building those relationships that will foster partnerships for the future. All of the federal, so if you want my papers, which I talked about, you can go to this tree search. People know about tree search? Okay, yeah. Every Forest Service publication is on there. It's all free. It doesn't matter if it's on a journal. It's free. So you can type my name in, or tribes, or whatever you want, that's free. And then here's questions and discussion time. Thank you very much. Yes?
That was really interesting. Thanks so much. So I have a couple of questions, and they might be linked, and this, I'm afraid, will show you my ignorance as far as tribal lands goes. I really don't know very much, so I learned a lot. Well, the first one is, does that law you referred to restricting the timber sales still stand? And then, as I said, this might be connected. I mean, I can well understand, and especially all the examples you gave, why a partnership or partnerships between the Forest Service and tribal lands would be beneficial both ways. But I guess I was wondering sort of why initially that was a legal requirement to have the tribal consultations.
Sure.
Because sort of I had assumed that tribal lands were like autonomous in their own land, and they could kind of do what they want, and so that's why in my mind those questions were linked.
Yeah.
If you so many, like I would have thought they could, cut as many trees down as they wanted.
Yeah. So to the first one, I'm not sure if that law is still sort of around.
Yeah.
It's probably superseded by this National Indian Forest Management Act of 1990, I believe. So that has all the sustainability requirements. Interestingly enough, if you look at Menominee and how much they harvest today, it's about 21 million board feet per year. It's a little bit more than they calculated. There's nobody exactly knows how they calculated that 20 million board feet per year, but they nailed it. That's the sustained yield for that forest, and has been for 170 years. It's unbelievable, and we talk about that a lot. It's really cool. So they're doing about the same harvest. Okay, the second question about consultation. So it's not that the consultation, so I work for the Forest Service. The Forest Service, the way it's set up in the US government is, I'm not responsible, or this Forest Service agency is not responsible for tribal forest management. What we are responsible for is providing sort of our programming and support. Because that's what we can do. The Bureau of Indian Affairs actually has foresters, and their job, it really is to manage that forest. Some tribes have the Bureau of Indian Affairs Forestry manage everything. Right? They're all Bureau employees. Other tribes have all tribal employees. Some tribes, and the way that's done is different in different cases. Again, all these tribes are different. But some of them, so the federal government has this trust responsibility. They're making sure that that resource is managed in perpetuity. So how that happens could be the Bureau of the federal employee. But what we're seeing is with tribal self-determination is more and more the tribes are taking over their programming that the federal government used to provide. And the federal government would say, well, we would spend this amount of money on forestry. Now here your tribe has to set up their own forestry. We'll just give you the money, and then you do it, following the same legal requirements for sustainability. And that's happening in healthcare, education, and a lot of spheres. And it's a conscious move to sort of enhance the sovereignty of the tribes, their self-determination. Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
So related to that, as I look across the Great Lakes region, I see these tribal natural resource department growing. And I see a lot of opportunity for tribal undergraduate students that have natural resources training to get jobs with those organizations. Is that what you're seeing as well? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, the programs are growing, especially as you see a shift from the federal side, side to the tribal side. There aren't enough students at this point, right? We don't have enough students to fill those departments. So many of these tribal departments don't have a lot of tribal members. Even if there are tribal members that are interested, there's things that happen along the way that don't get them in there. And that was the case from Menominee back when I showed those early 1910 pictures of that sawmill, even until today. I think now at this point, the sawmill itself is, I want to say, like 90% Menominee, so that's pretty good. Forest management, once you start getting up into the higher level professional jobs, not as much. So there's a real need both for sort of technicians on the ground. Timber markers are probably all going to be tribal members. That's like the first starting point. You don't need a forestry degree to do the marking. Right? You work underneath a silviculturist and they help you with it. They train you and you do it out there. But to do the silviculture prescriptions, you do need a degree for that. Yeah, and there's a huge need. So I'm hopeful at this point. We have tribal colleges. Salish Kootenai College in Montana has a 4-year forestry degree program. That's amazing. A lot of them have technical degrees in sort of natural resource management. That also is an opportunity to, you know, work with students to bring them for their undergrad degrees, and then hopefully some of those will stay for advanced degrees. And you know, how to do that, I think we're trying to figure that out. There's a few things. You know, looking at that partnership thing, you need that leadership that says this is important. You need some of the faculty and staff that reflect those communities or are working on projects that are of interest to those communities. So, I'm a forester. I work with Menominee. I'm not Menominee. But they're very open to working with me because the value that I bring to forestry is a similar value that they have for forestry. And the research that I do enhances their forest management ability to do that. Some of the research that's come out looking at American Indian graduate students, and I think, again, undergrads are probably the same, they're not doing it for personal gain, like a lot of students are, or personal knowledge building. They see themselves as part of the whole community. And they're doing it in order to make their communities better, to respond to those needs. So if that's a different way of looking at graduate students. And but if we understand like what that need is, that the need is greater than the individual, and that community is part of it, we can start, you know, making sure that community is part of the program, making sure that we build both community on campus, as well as opportunities to interact with their broader communities. Because again, that's their goal. For the most, not everyone, but when we do surveys and research on it, that's what comes out. Many of them do. So, you know, so you have staff and faculty that are either doing research that's of interest to the community, or actually native faculty. And then once you start bringing in the students too, making sure that there's more than one or two, right? It's good to have kind of a cohort idea on this thing. And what I'm seeing at Minnesota, and I'm really excited about and want to increase this, is the relationships with American Indian Studies. So if you have a student that can double major in Ojibwe and forestry, how cool is that? That's amazing. And that not only helps that student and their community at home, but it helps our forestry. All these words that describe ecology and species and relationship, that brings, so when they're learning those in Ojibwe class, they're bringing that into their forestry. Right? They're understanding things on a different level. And that enhances all of our programs. So I think building those partnerships like, among the colleges on our campuses is important as well.
So I'm a student who is doing that. I'm double majoring in American, well, in a lot. But anyways, I won't go into the specifics. But I am wondering if if it would be more beneficial for me to. I'm having an internship with the Odawa tribe this summer, and I am wondering if you think it would be more beneficial to try to learn the language with people there, or if I should try to get some background knowledge beforehand. And you know, I could have I think it might be a little bit too late now, but I could have taken it this semester and, you know, had some more language experience and go into it. So I don't know, which do you think if it makes a difference, would be more beneficial, or if anyone else can speak on this, I don't know.
Yeah,
Yes.
do you want to go first?
So Nokomis Center has some language tables that you could go to. I think they're starting up again. And then we're finally going to have our own language teacher in the fall. I mean, that doesn't help you through the summer, but anything that you can do beforehand, I would say would be great, because you said you're going in the summer. And then there's, speaking also to the community project aspect, I would invite everybody to come to what we call our sugar bush. So we're going to go do maple sugaring at Fenner Nature Center, and that's a time to learn about the community, but also if you've never tapped trees and make delicious candy and all of the goodies that you can make with maple syrup. That's also a time to learn the stories of that time of the season and the culture and the community, and any of those type of events. And our powwow is this weekend too. So yeah, so if you go to, I'm the grad assistant for the program. So I just changed our website. It's the American Indian Indigenous Studies Program website. Right on our front page on the right hand side is a list of all of our activities.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
And I would say too, when you're in the community, there's going to be the same opportunities. Most likely there's probably some language training that they're doing at the community level, and I'm sure they would welcome people.
Okay.
There's going to be, like, the Boys and Girls Club is going to do something. There's going to be a powwow. There's going to be a community feast.
Yeah, I think they have like immersion weekends, so I will be definitely able to get some.
Which tribe are you?
Odawa.
And which?
The little trappers.
The little
Yeah,
tribe. Yeah, they have a powwow in the summer. Language tables.
And part of it is just being respectful and understanding sort of where you're coming from. And just like with any other community, I always think, like working with Menominee, why? It's so amazing, they've been doing this forestry. So I grew up in Green Bay, I went to Madison, like we talk about this all the time. It's like, oh, I can learn from these people. This is amazing, I'm gonna learn so much. And it's gonna be good for a broader, community. And entering in, I was in the Peace Corps as well. Entering in as a way, I'm not going there to help, I'm not going there to like save anyone. I'm going in to learn and to build something together. And that learning aspect is like kind of a humility, humble thing where I go in and I don't know too much, not being afraid to ask questions. Because again, it's done in a respectful manner, that's okay. It's okay. We don't all, I mean, our communities are doing the same thing. I don't speak Potawatomi, right? We're trying to bring that language back as well. And pretty much all of our tribes are like that. There are a few larger ones that have many, many more speakers, but our tribes here in the Great Lakes, language is a big issue. We don't have that many sort of first language speakers with us anymore, right? And so there's a big effort to teach people, and it's a good thing to learn about the tribes where you're living. And learning some of the language is important to you. Is there a question?
Yeah, all people I think we can agree are connected to forest in some way, but in Michigan, many of the tribes are forest poor, is the best way to describe it. So working for the Forest Service, do you still have some sort of outreach to those tribes, or do you just focus on the ones that have forest lands?
Yeah, so I've helped the Forest Service in the eastern region here develop their strategic plan for working with tribes. Again, I'm a planner. So one of the things we did is we developed a consultation guideline or information for every national forest in the eastern region, so including Michigan, what tribes need to be consulted with for basically any project. So it says, these are the tribes you need to build relationships with. And one of the things that I think is different when we wrote this, I think we first did it 10 years ago. One of the things that's different is we looked at tribes like mine who are now in Oklahoma, yet might have something to say about the Huron-Manistee, for example, national forest. So we included those removed tribes consciously in our list. So there'll be 20, 30 different tribes for each national forest that says, you really need to contact these tribes and form relationships with them. Even though they're a couple states away in a different Forest Service region, right? That's a different, Oklahoma's not in the Houston region where we are here. So yeah, we do, so any decision or any policy change, we need to consult with those tribes.
Yeah, that's on the federal land though. I'm talking more about the individual tribes and their land and interacting with them. And some tribes will have forest lands, others don't. So I was really trying to get at, what about those who don't? Is there some programs that there's some sort of link to the Forest Service still?
Most of that, from my perspective, is probably through our partnerships. So if we can build a partnership, or at least knowing about each other, that a tribe can come to us. We provide technical assistance, and because they're federally recognized, we need to do that. So that would come through there. Oh shoot, I had one other thing where we were working. It escapes my mind right now. There's a program on our state and private forestry side that it provides money for tribes to purchase essentially conservation land. So they can use that program to buy tribal land back, and then part of those programmings would be to help sort of with the management. And it's a small program, but it's valuable, and some of the tribes are using it. There's restrictions with the money, so it doesn't meet all tribal needs, but it certainly is a way that tribes can, it's another source of revenue that they could use to purchase back land. And many of the tribes that have lost their land through allotment are actively, and have been for decades now, trying to buy it back, so that it comes back. So the reservation outline is there, but there's no tribal land. That reservation didn't go away, but the land, the sovereign control over that land did. So the tribes buy, like Oneida, they've been buying back and buying back, and then using that land to put in forestry, to put in fisheries. They've done some fishing kind of things. They have a creek that runs through there. The creek it's wide. It's a big creek that runs through there. They've been restoring that, working on runoff and stuff, because there's lots of ag around. So they've been using these, buying back the land, but then actually managing them. And the Forest Service, we would be with them and help them however they would like. But if you don't have that partnership with them, you don't know what they want. And some of it is like that conservation easement stuff, or the conservation land. I forget the program's name. We wouldn't know that people wanted to buy back their land or to do stream bank restoration if we didn't talk to them. So it helps us sometimes when the tribes are saying, well, we really want to do this, but we can't because we don't have this other thing. So, well, let's try to make that happen. And some of those intertribal groups help with that. So Intertribal Timber Council has lobbied, because they can lobby, right? They've pushed through and supported legislation for the Tribal Forest Protection Act, which basically says if you have federal land that's threatening tribal land, tribal resources and federal resources can be used to mitigate that. So if it's a fire hazard that happens, or if it's an insect outbreak, that money can be spent. And the tribes are telling us, we need this. We don't want your fires on the Forest Service to come and burn down all our stuff. Because we've been, you saw the pictures, we've been doing a good job here, but nothing can stop that, that really high intensity fire.
To what extent do you think that tribal forest management could benefit from other disciplines that are tangentially related to forestry? For example, I'm a paleoecologist, and I take a deep dive geological perspective on environmental change. And so my research right now is actually looking at Native American land use impacts on the environment in the northeastern United States, going back 5,000, 6,000 years. And one of the things that I'd like to do is I'd like to think that my research is going to be wasted just on a few academics or paleoecologists. I'd actually like to bring it to tribal groups, and to help maybe some way this can inform management decisions or restoration of ecosystems, to take a long-term geological view about what's possible in a particular landscape.
No, I think that's great, and a little bit of caution on forming, those are the partnerships and relationship building, so that the tribes can really understand what you're doing, explaining in a way that doesn't it doesn't put you as the expert. You're an expert in what you've done,
Right.
but not necessarily an expert on how that landscape has changed over time from your perspective. So like really having that mutual relationship is something that's good. You know, I find there's lots of lakes that have wild rice in people's stories, but it's not there anymore. You could find that in the sediment, and your techniques could really help.
Especially in Michigan.
In Michigan, in Minnesota,
There's no
Wisconsin.
Menominee anymore.
yeah. So those techniques, you know, tribes want that, but it has to be done in a partnership, and that's the key. So that's great. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. This has been great.